She had never forgotten the way they looked at her the first time she stepped into their immaculate home. His mother's eyes scanned her worn dress like a customs officer searching for contraband, while his father's lips tightened into a thin line of disapproval. They had invited her for dinner, but the invitation had been a performance, a test she failed before she even sat down. Somewhere between the soup and the main course, they let it slip, or perhaps they wanted her to hear it, that their son could do better. They said she was sweet but too poor, as if her bank account determined her worth. She laughed it off in front of them, but later cried in her tiny apartment. 10 years passed, and she built a life they never imagined for her, one of power, wealth, and influence. On a Tuesday morning, she walked into a sleek conference room to finalize the acquisition of a struggling company. When the doors opened, she saw their faces again, pale and shocked. This was their company, and she was there to buy it. She had been nervous all day, the kind of restless anticipation that makes every clock tick sound louder. This was supposed to be the night she met the parents of the man she had been dating for almost a year, the night that might solidify her place in his life. She chose her outfit carefully, settling on a simple navy dress with modest heels, her hair smoothed down and her makeup understated. She wanted to appear polished, but not pretentious, sophisticated yet approachable. When she arrived at their address, her breath caught in her throat. The house rose before her like a monument to wealth, wide steps leading to an imposing door framed by perfect hedges, floor-to-ceiling windows glowing warmly from inside. It was beautiful, but it made her acutely aware of the faint scuff on her shoe and the fact that her coat was 2 seasons old. Inside, everything gleamed. Marble floors reflected the golden light of crystal chandeliers, and every surface was arranged to be both functional and artful. The walls were adorned with paintings that looked as though they belonged in a gallery. Her boyfriend's mother swept into the foyer first, tall and impeccably dressed, her perfume delicate but expensive. She smiled, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. His father followed, his handshake firm but brief, his gaze moving over her in an appraising glance that felt more like an evaluation than a greeting. They guided her to the dining room, where the table was set with polished silverware, crystal glasses, and an array of dishes that looked like they'd come straight from a fine dining restaurant. She sat across from them, with her boyfriend to her right, caught in the awkward role of bridge between two worlds. At first, the conversation was polite, the kind of small talk that skims the surface without revealing much. His mother asked about her work, and when she explained her current role, the woman's eyebrow lifted just slightly, almost imperceptibly. Before she took a sip of wine, his father inquired about her family, and when she spoke about her modest upbringing, there was a pause, a silence that felt heavier than the words themselves. She noticed the subtle glances they exchanged, the faint tightening around his father's mouth when she mentioned renting a small apartment, the way his mother's voice softened into a tone reserved for people who needed pity rather than respect. The meal was exquisite, but she tasted little of it. The lamb was tender, the vegetables perfectly seasoned, but every bite felt like an act of endurance. She tried to hold her posture, to keep her voice steady, but under the table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Between courses, his mother leaned back in her chair and began to talk about marriage, hypothetically, of course. She spoke about compatibility, not just in love, but in lifestyle, in background, in ambition. It was framed as wisdom, the kind of advice passed down from one generation to the next, but each sentence landed like a subtle blow. She spoke of the challenges of unequal matches, of how shared standards were vital to a successful union. His father, meanwhile, nodded in agreement, adding that financial stability was a cornerstone of any partnership. The words were cloaked in generalities, but the meaning was razor sharp. She wasn't good enough, not for their son, not for their family, not for the life they envisioned for him. Her boyfriend sat stiffly, his eyes fixed on his plate, his fork moving food around, but not eating much. He didn't defend her, didn't interject, didn't shift the topic. and that silence said as much as his parents' thinly veiled criticism. By the time dessert arrived, a delicate arrangement of chocolate and fruit, she had already built a wall inside herself. She smiled when she needed to, nodded when expected, even laughed softly when something called for it, but she was retreating behind a mask. When the evening finally ended, they walked her to the door with polite goodbyes and a promise to do this again sometime. As she stepped outside into the cool night air, she exhaled for the first time in hours. The weight of their judgment clung to her like the scent of their perfume, subtle yet inescapable. She knew, with a sharp clarity that made her chest ache, that she had just been measured and found lacking. And though she told herself it didn't matter, that she didn't need their approval, it happened on a grey Saturday morning. A small voice inside, the kind where the sky looked as though it had been painted in watered-down ash, and not in her favour. She had been at home, half distractedly tidying her small apartment, when his message arrived. It wasn't a phone call, not even a voice note, just a string of words on a screen, short and final. He said it wasn't working, that they were too different, that their lives were heading in opposite directions. He thanked her for everything and wished her well. That was it. No explanation beyond what could be written in a few curt sentences. She read it over and over, each time expecting the words to rearrange themselves into something softer, something less abrupt. But they didn't. She sat down on the edge of her bed, her phone heavy in her hand, her heart pounding in a rhythm that seemed both too fast and too slow at once. It wasn't a conversation, it was a verdict. In the days that followed, she tried to replay every moment that might have led to this. She thought of the dinner with his parents, the way the air had felt thick with judgment, the subtle tightening of his jaw when his father spoke, the evasive silence he had kept. At the time, she told herself that maybe he just didn't want to create conflict. Now, she saw it differently. It wasn't that he didn't want to take sides, it was that his side had already been chosen. She could picture the conversations that must have happened behind closed doors, the quiet, persuasive phrases his mother might have used, the hints his father might have dropped about expectations, stability, and the right kind of partner. She imagined him listening, maybe resisting at first, but eventually nodding along. Her friends told her she was better off, that anyone who could end things in a text didn't deserve her time. They encouraged her to get out, distract herself, meet new people. But beneath their comfort, there was a current of humiliation she couldn't shake. It wasn't just the loss of the relationship, it was the manner of it, the way it was taken from her, decided for her, as though she had no part in the outcome. There was no closure, no mutual agreement, just a cold severing that left her holding the frayed end of something she'd thought was still whole. She didn't reach out to him. She didn't demand an explanation. Pride kept her silent, even as nights stretched long with unanswered questions. She packed away the small reminders of their time together. The coffee mug he'd bought her on a trip, the sweater she'd borrowed and never returned, the photographs that had once felt like promises. Each item went into a box that she shoved to the back of her closet, as though burying them might bury the ache. What hurt most wasn't that he'd left, it was that he'd let others decide he should. She could feel their presence in the breakup, the invisible hands that had guided him away from her. She wasn't naive enough to think that love alone could erase the gap between their worlds, but she had believed it was worth trying. He hadn't, and in the quiet of her apartment, with only the faint hum of the refrigerator to keep her company, she began to understand that this wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was the end of a chapter in which she had believed that being good, kind, and loyal would be enough to win over people determined to see her as less. Weeks later, she saw him once more by accident. He was walking out of a cafe, his parents beside him, their faces set in the same composed expressions she remembered from that dinner. He didn't see her, or if he did, he pretended not to. She stood still, watching them disappear into a sleek black car, feeling the familiar sting rise in her chest. It wasn't longing anymore, it was something colder, something sharper, not hate, but the first spark of resolve, because in that moment, she made herself a silent promise. She would never again allow someone else's opinion of her worth to dictate her life. The pain was still there, raw and unsoftened, But beneath it, something new was taking root, a determination she hadn't felt before. She didn't know yet how she would rebuild, how she would shape the pieces of herself into something stronger, but she knew she would. And one day, she would no longer be the girl dismissed with a text message and a polite goodbye. One day, she would be the woman they wished they had never underestimated. She disappeared from their world quietly, without announcements or dramatic declarations, while they continued their lives convinced she had faded into obscurity. She was building something in the shadows. The first months were the hardest. She was still nursing the wound of betrayal, still waking up with the memory of his absence pressing against her chest. But grief, she discovered, was an energy source, one that could be converted into motion if she refused to let it stagnate. She began with what she had: a small savings account, a cramped apartment, and a notebook filled with half-formed business ideas. The people around her assumed she would choose a safe job, something modest that kept her afloat. Instead, she began teaching herself skills she had once thought were out of her reach. She worked in the day and studied at night, her eyes aching from the glow of the laptop screen. Marketing, finance, negotiation subjects that had once seemed dry now became weapons in her arsenal. She took online courses she could barely afford, applied for internships she was overqualified for just to get inside certain rooms, and listened more than she spoke. In those early years, there were no glamorous victories, only small, incremental gains. She took on freelance projects for companies that barely remembered her name once the work was done. But each one added another brick to the foundation she was building. She kept meticulous records, tracked every dollar, and learned to stretch resources until they yielded more than anyone expected. There were setbacks, moments when she questioned whether the climb was worth it. Deals fell through, clients ghosted her, opportunities dissolved without explanation. But each loss seemed to harden her resolve instead of breaking it. She began to understand that silence was her ally. The fewer people knew about her plans, the less they could interfere. She didn't post about her progress on social media, didn't seek validation in likes or comments. Her victories were hers alone, unpublicized and unchallenged. By the 5th year, her network had quietly expanded. She had contacts in industries she had once known nothing about, people who respected her not because of where she came from, but because of what she could deliver. Her reputation grew through whispers and referrals, not through grand introductions. The girl they had dismissed as too poor had become a figure others sought for advice, though she still worked from the same modest space and dressed without display. The wealth she was accumulating wasn't just financial, it was knowledge, influence, leverage. Her transformation was not sudden. It was like the slow sharpening of a blade, invisible until it was dangerous to touch. She had learned to read contracts like stories, to anticipate moves before they were made, to spot lies in the smallest details. She became careful about the alliances she formed, understanding that trust was currency more valuable than money. Her past had taught her that there were people who would look her in the eye and still work to undermine her. She didn't waste time trying to change them anymore. She simply made sure that when they saw her again, she would be standing in a place they could never reach. By the time the 10th year began, the silence she had cultivated was not emptiness, it was power. She was no longer chasing opportunities, they were finding her. She could choose the terms, decline offers without fear of scarcity. She looked at the life she had built, piece by deliberate piece, and realized that the woman she had become would have been unrecognizable to the girl who once sat at that dinner table under the weight of their judgment. She did not think often about him or his parents anymore, but when she did, it was with a distant kind of curiosity, as one might think of a faded photograph. She wondered if they still believed in the words they had spoken that night, if they had any idea how wrong they had been. She never reached out, never sent a letter or a message. She was waiting, without urgency, for the day fate would arrange the meeting for her. And when that day came, she knew she would be ready, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with the quiet, undeniable truth of everything she had built in the years they thought she was gone. The first whisper came through a trade newsletter she almost deleted without reading. A short, unremarkable article buried between market updates mentioned that a well-known family-owned business was facing strategic challenges and considering restructuring options. She read the name twice, her eyes locking onto it with a jolt of recognition. It was their company, the one his parents had proudly boasted about over expensive wine, the one they had held up as proof of their superiority. The piece was vague, but she had spent enough years in business to know that corporate language often hid desperation. She bookmarked the article and kept moving through her day, but the thought kept pulling her back. A single weak link in a chain that had once seemed unbreakable. Over the next few weeks, more hints surfaced. Suppliers complaining about delayed payments, quiet layoffs in departments that had always been stable, a rumor about a failed expansion into a new market. She began to gather everything: public filings, market analysis, competitor reports, assembling the pieces into a picture that looked worse with each passing day. The company wasn't just struggling, it was bleeding. Bad decisions layered over arrogance had eroded their market share. Leadership seemed frozen, unable to adapt to new realities, still clinging to the belief that their name alone was enough to secure loyalty. She didn't rush in. Patience was still her sharpest weapon. Instead, she positioned herself on the periphery, strengthening ties with industry contacts who might have inside knowledge. She learned that key executives were quietly looking for new jobs, and that banks were pressing for repayment on loans that had been extended in more optimistic times. The collapse wasn't immediate, but it was inevitable. She also learned that the family was divided. Some wanted to sell parts of the business to raise capital. Others saw that as a betrayal of their legacy. Their infighting was slowing decisions, deepening the cracks. Behind her calm exterior, she was already planning. This was not about revenge, not entirely. It was about opportunity, one she had earned the skill to recognize and the resources to seize. She began speaking to investors, presenting the company's potential. If she were discussing a purely theoretical acquisition, her pitch was precise. The business had a recognizable brand, infrastructure worth salvaging, and a loyal customer base that had been alienated by recent mismanagement. Under new leadership, it could recover and grow. She didn't mention her personal history with the owners. That was a detail for later. The more she researched, the more she realized how avoidable their downfall had been. They had refused to modernize, dismissing new trends as fads. They had ignored the shifting needs of their customers, believing tradition would outweigh change. And most damning of all, they had underestimated the competition, allowing smaller, more agile companies to chip away at their dominance. Every mistake was catalogued in her mind, not just as evidence of their decline, but as a roadmap for how she would rebuild once the company was hers. The moment the announcement came, a formal statement that they were exploring acquisition offers, she was ready. She moved quickly, but without fanfare, stepping into negotiations through an intermediary. Her identity was concealed at first, her bids presented as part of a consortium. The family, desperate for a lifeline, welcomed any serious offer. They didn't yet know who was sitting on the other side of the table, reviewing their financials, evaluating the assets they had once considered untouchable. Even as the talks progressed, she kept her emotions in check. It was tempting to imagine their faces when they discovered the truth, but she wouldn't allow sentiment to cloud the deal. This was business, and business demanded precision. She scrutinized every clause, every liability, ensuring that when the papers were signed, she would not inherit their mistakes, only the parts of the company worth saving. By the time the negotiations neared completion, the image of that dinner years ago had faded to a distant memory. What remained was the clarity of the present moment, the chance to take control of something they had believed she would never even touch. They had once dismissed her as insignificant. Now their survival depended on a beer they had not yet met, a beer who had spent a decade preparing for this moment without their knowledge. She didn't see the acquisition as a final act, but as the beginning of something larger. The company would be reshaped, rebuilt in her vision, free from the arrogance that had nearly destroyed it. And when they learned who had saved them on her terms, at her price, it would be too late for them to change the story. The narrative would belong to her, as it should have from the start. The morning of the deal began with an unsettling calm, the kind of quiet that felt more like the pause before a storm than a peaceful start to the day. She woke before her alarm, her mind already moving through the sequence of events to come. Every detail had been rehearsed over and over in the weeks leading to this moment: what to say, when to say it, what not to reveal too soon. Outside, the city still carried that early grey light before the streets fully came alive, and she found herself staring at it for a moment, grounding herself in the reality that this was no longer a plan. Today, it would become fact. Her preparation was deliberate, almost ritualistic. Every choice, from the understated navy suit she selected to the simple gold watch on her wrist, was made with purpose. She wanted to project authority without excess, confidence without arrogance. The papers had already been reviewed a dozen times, her notes carefully organized, contingencies prepared in case the family attempted to push back at the last minute. She had no intention of giving them any room to maneuver. By the time she arrived at the building where the final signing would take place, the sun had risen enough to cast sharp reflections off the glass facade. She paused at the entrance, not to hesitate, but to acknowledge privately the symbolic nature of this step. Once she crossed that threshold, the power dynamic that had been so uneven all those years ago would be reversed completely. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee. A receptionist greeted her politely, oblivious to the history who hid into that room. The conference space chosen for the meeting was large enough to hold the deal team, legal representatives, and the family members who had insisted on attending in person. They were already there when she entered, seated along one side of the table. Their expressions were measured, perhaps attempting to hide the strain of the company's financial condition. Papers were neatly stacked in front of them, pens poised beside contracts that could end decades of control in a matter of minutes. She recognized their posture immediately, the same posture they had held during that long-ago dinner, when they had judged her without hesitation. Now, the balance had shifted. The intermediaries who had handled most of the negotiations were present, keeping the atmosphere professional and removing any trace of personal confrontation, at least for the moment. The discussions began with formalities, each party confirming the terms already outlined. Her voice was steady as she addressed points of clarification, never rushing, never allowing the pace to be dictated by anyone else at the table. Her legal counsel, seated to her right, occasionally slid a document closer to her, indicating where signatures would be needed. For nearly an hour, the meeting unfolded in this controlled rhythm. It was only when the last set of documents was presented that the moment she had been anticipating arrived. The lead family member, once the loudest voice, opposing her relationship with their son, glanced across the table with a hint of suspicion, as if finally piecing together what was about to happen. She said nothing, letting the recognition spread on its own. The transaction details made it unavoidable. Her name, her company's name, her position as the acquiring party, printed clearly across the top of the final agreement. There was a shift in the air, almost imperceptible at first, then undeniable. The controlled expressions faltered. The patriarch's pen paused midair, his gaze fixed on her with a mixture of disbelief and something sharp, a pride bruised beyond repair. Still, no words were exchanged beyond the necessary legal acknowledgements. She did not gloat, did not break the professional barrier she had maintained throughout. Instead, she let the silence do the work. Each signature they made binding them not only to the deal, but to the reality that she now held the reins of what they had built. When it was her turn to sign, she did so with precision, her handwriting steady and deliberate. There was no flourish, no unnecessary emphasis, just the act itself. The final page was slid back across the table. The deal officially closed. She leaned back slightly, not in triumph, but in completion. It was done. The company was hers. The family, who had once measured her worth in the narrowest possible terms, now had to acknowledge her as the owner of their legacy. As the meeting concluded, there were polite nods and restrained farewells. They left the room in small groups, avoiding eye contact more than necessary. She remained seated for a moment longer, letting the weight of the day settle over her. Outside those doors, the business world would soon know of the acquisition. The press release was already scheduled, her internal team briefed to handle incoming attention. But here, in the quiet aftermath of the signing, she allowed herself a single breath of satisfaction before moving forward. The deal was never just about taking control of a company. It was about reclaiming the narrative of her own life. Today, that reclamation was complete. The years of work, the silence she had chosen, the patience she had cultivated all had led to this single point in time, where the balance was corrected, and her place at the head of the table was no longer in question. She rose, gathered her documents, and walked out without looking back, the sound of her heels on the polished floor marking each step into the future she had built entirely on her own terms. She stepped out of the glass tower into the open air, the automatic doors whispering shut behind her as if sealing away the chapter that had just ended. The midday light was sharper than she expected, reflecting off the polished pavement and catching in the chrome of passing cars. The city's hum swelled around her, traffic weaving in slow fits, distant sirens, the rise and fall of conversation spilling from nearby cafes, but none of it seemed to touch her. The air felt different, as though the act of leaving that building had shifted the weight of the world by a fraction, just enough to let her breathe more fully. She walked without hurry, the measured rhythm of her steps contrasting the restless energy of the people brushing past her. The folder in her hand was light, deceptively so, given that it contained the final contracts, the physical proof of the acquisition, and in a way, of the last 10 years of her life. She thought about how many nights she had worked alone at her kitchen table, tracing strategy on paper with a pen that ran out of ink too often, eating meals that went cold before she remembered to take a bite. No one walking past her now would ever know the cost of that work or the quiet moments where she had almost given into exhaustion. They would only see the final image, a woman leaving an office tower with a deal closed in her name. She turned down a quieter side street, away from the main current of people. Here, the air was softer, shaded by tall brick buildings and the scent of fresh bread drifting from a bakery nearby. She slowed her pace, letting the noise of the main avenue fade. Her mind moved backward and forward all at once, flashes of the dinner where she had first met them, the sting of their rejection, the cold precision of the day. They made sure she understood she was not enough. The memory no longer burned, it had cooled into something distant, like an old scar she could trace without pain. She realized that the transaction today had not been about proving them wrong in their eyes. It had been about proving herself right in her own. Reaching a small park, she found an empty bench and sat, the sunlight slipping through branches to warm her hands. She placed the folder beside her and leaned back, looking up at the patchwork of green above. 10 years earlier, she might have imagined this moment as one of fireworks and applause, a cinematic end to a long battle. Instead, it was quiet, peaceful. The satisfaction was not in the spectacle, but in the stillness that came when nothing more needed to be done. She was no longer fighting for a seat at anyone else's table. She had built her own, and if others wanted a place at it, they would have to earn it. Across the park, a group of children played, their laughter carrying in the breeze. For a fleeting moment, she envied the purity of their world, how untouched it was by the kinds of struggles that had shaped her. But she also understood that without those struggles, she would not have become the person sitting here now, with the power to decide her own course. She watched them for a few minutes before standing, brushing a faint trace of dust from her sleeve and picking up the folder again. The walk back toward her car was unhurried, each step carrying her further from the shadow of the family's judgment and deeper into the reality she had built for herself. People crossed her path, strangers whose eyes slid past her without recognition, unaware that they were passing someone who had just dismantled a piece of history and rewritten it in her own name. She felt no need to correct their ignorance. Anonymity had been her strength for so long, and in many ways, it still was. When she reached the parking garage, She paused before unlocking her car. From here, she could still see the top of the building where the meeting had taken place, its mirrored windows catching the afternoon light. She studied it for a moment, not with bitterness, but with a detached clarity. It was now part of her story, but not the whole of it. That chapter was closed, bound and filed away like the contracts she carried. She turned away from it, slipped into the driver's seat, and started the engine. As she pulled into traffic, the city unfolded before her in shifting lanes and changing lights. The day's weight settled into her in a new way, less like a burden, more like a foundation. Whatever came next would be built on this moment, but it would not be defined by it. She had walked into that room carrying the echoes of a judgment past years ago. She was walking away with the echoes gone, replaced by a silence that felt like freedom. The road ahead stretched open, and for the first time in years, she didn't need to look back to know she had already won.